Hello, everyone. My name is Spencer Walsh. Welcome to today's show. We have a good one for you, as always. On the show today, we have a lot of stories that may well be irrelevant by the time you're listening to this. We're gonna hopefully do a good enough show to be able to avoid a lot of that by kind of giving you all the analysis you need for whatever possible situation may happen. The first instance of a story like this is our lead story today. The Kamala Harris VP race, meeting with VP finalists set to unveil the choice by Tuesday morning in a digital video. So that's probably going to be already out by the time you are listening to it. Also, the stock market has tumbled. We'll take a look at one of the biggest causes of that, which is some of the jobs numbers that was released just about, I think it was last week. Yeah, it would have been last Friday where they released the jobs numbers for the month of July. They were not good, and we'll tell you why that kind of set in a downward spiral in motion. Also, Google is a monopolist. The judge has ruled in a landmark antitrust case. I'll tell you why that's significant, and the latest regarding Iran and its imminent attack, supposedly, on Israel. An interesting take on why that was all set into motion by Netanyahu. An interesting update on a controversial report on UNRWA, the UN agency that helps Palestinians, and really why it still cannot be confirmed. And Cori Bush has her election tomorrow. All right, so we start with Kamala Harris and the VP situation. So pretty much, let's be real here. By the time it's almost foolish to report any kind of news, any of the back and forth. There are almost equally good indicators that it'll either be Tim Walz or it will either be Josh Shapiro, the governors of Minnesota and Pennsylvania, respectively. And again, it's hard to know. I think Walz is a bit better of a politician. He's a bit more of an kind of example of a Democrat who gets things done. So it's something I think you just, in terms of a pure what I want level, I think I would like to see somebody who has he's somebody who is on paper is a moderate, but did things effectively that were kind of bread and butter Democratic policies, like passing free school meals for kids, doing tax rebates for the working class, and tax rises on the rich, legalizing weed, and a bunch of other things like that. He's a pretty impressive laundry list in Minnesota. Not maybe as progressive as a laundry list, or maybe not as impressive for Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, I would say, which is why you see some progressives that begin to favor him. I think there is no progressive or any kind of real left winger that has anything to be too excited about with either of these candidates. Let's be 100% real. But I think also personally I would go with Tim Walz over Josh Shapiro because I think he's also a bit of a better communicator. I think the white Obama method has been tried many different times and it just hasn't really worked that well. Walz really put into perspective an incredibly powerful attack line that I have been seeing quite a lot actually take shape in kind of, believe it or not, like kind of irony socialist online left circles of the Republicans are weird. Like they were like that was saying, shout out to the polling analyst and the elections analyst on Twitter, Josh Cohen. Edinger Mentum is his screen name, but he's been on, kind of left-wing media outlets for quite a long time talking about, the Republicans are weird. This is why they lost the 2022 election. This was the extreme conservatism just repels people. Extreme social conservatism just repels people. And that was, proven true. And Tim Walz was the first mainstream politician to bring that to the forefront. So I think he's a very, very good communicator. And I also think, for a politically, he is much more kind of replaceable in Minnesota. Someone else could kind of slide in to that position. To state with also a pretty strong progressive bench. So for the left of the party, that could be pretty good. Although, Shapiro, I think the risk that you run with him is he has several pieces of baggage, including paying a settlement to cover up sexual harassment from a close aide. And also there was this woman who was essentially the fiance of one of the kind of political patron families of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia called the Hankin family. And so this Hankin heir this male Henkin heir was essentially stabbed this woman, it seems like, his fiance in the neck, and Shapiro's office, when he was the attorney general, played a role in helping to rule it a suicide. I didn't get the full details on this, but I think there was some way of attempting to screw over the progressive DA there at the time, Larry Krasner, which is a little bit interesting. So, that is one bit of baggage there for him as well. He's also, been pretty hawkish in terms of insulting Palestinians. We saw, it was his college newspaper article when he was 20. It was just like, I think Palestinians aren't a very peace-loving people. I think the fact that I don't hold them against it. I've said I'm in college right now. I've said some pretty controversial things, and maybe if I'm going for a job, I don't want to. I've been doing this podcast since I've been in 8th grade. I don't know if I necessarily want every single word that I've said on this podcast played back. When I was younger, because it was not a very, you don't always say everything right, but I think the fact that now as a 40-plus-year-old man, he hasn't come out and disavowed what he said and came out and condemned it is also, I think it's very telling of the media. It's also very telling of his position. So it's likely going to be these two guys here, and it's kind of impossible to know which one it's going to be. But I've told you here why I kind of lean towards lean towards Walz a little bit and a little bit away from Shapiro. Although I don't think anyone has anything super excited about if you're kind of on the left like me about either of these candidates. I think both could have some pretty good electoral impacts with Pennsylvania for Josh Shapiro, unless some of these baggage that I just mentioned before comes back to bite him. He will definitely help with Pennsylvania. He's pretty popular there. He has a kind of great style that fits with a lot of the voters in Pennsylvania that they really respect him for. Walz is pretty popular, but also, he's a little less popular in his state than Shapiro is. But again, with that weird attack line, he has that kind of political communication skills down very, very well, and also hits with people, I think, in a way that's very, very relatable. He comes off as he has a lot of kind of that Midwestern Rust Belt affect that's going to be pretty popular, and also going to be kind of the ticket of normalcy and the ticket of good vibes versus the ticket of just insane social conservatism in J.D. Vance and just pure insanity in Donald Trump. So I think you could probably get that contrast with both in terms of the political candidates, but I think just the baggage that Josh Shapiro has is almost too big of a risk. But given the fact that he is pretty well loved by the moderates of the party, we saw Joe Scarborough coming out and saying that anyone criticizing him for his long history of being anti-Palestine and pro-Israel is this is a guy who volunteered for the IDF. He didn't get drafted. He wasn't an Israeli citizen that got drafted in. He went over and volunteered, which I think is quite telling. The fact that he has felt, not just the fact that he did it, but the fact that he hasn't been asked or felt no need to come out and explain what he was doing there. I think that is, very, very telling. And just the criticism of him for that, again, of course, I think that's not something that's anti-Semitic, but we've seen that from a lot of people. But Nancy Pelosi, of all people, is someone who is obviously, I would stand by, more responsible than any one individual on the face of this earth for getting Joe Biden to drop out of the presidential race. This is something that was really, really clear that she wanted. She was someone that was pretty pro-Walz. She leaked it. And apparently a lot of other House members really do like Walz, so that's something that could be helpful for him down the road. But again, I honestly don't think, with regards to this VP pick, it doesn't seem to make too big of a difference. We'll try and get a show up for you tomorrow about analyzing who the VP is going to be. But I don't think either way Kamala will be too completely hurt if she picks one over the other. Again, because even with Shapiro, he kind of has the better electoral case, but then he does have a lot of that other baggage that we talked about before regarding the murder suicide kind of situation and the sexual harassment case as well, along with dividing the base on the issue of Israel. And where we have Tim Walz, who comes, he definitely has a pro-Israel past, like pretty much every single Democratic politician there is, but in recent times has come out a lot more a lot more in the camp of the Palestinians side, saying we got to listen to the Palestinians. St. Paul Minneapolis has a pretty high Muslim population, so that's something that maybe he's been politically forced to take a little bit more seriously than Shapiro has. But either way, it will be a relatively. I don't think it's going to make a big ripple in the race too much with these two finalists, Walz and Shapiro. They should have about the same impact on the campaign. Although, for a variety of reasons, again, reading the tea leaves, I guess you kind of say he's kind of closer to the left ideologically with Walz, and the fact that he just seems to be a better political communicator and has less baggage, I personally would go for Walz. The stock market has gone down today pretty badly. The Federal Reserve cut rates outside of its scheduled meetings, or didn't cut rates actually in the, I think it was the third quarter meeting, or the third quarter meeting. They do a meeting every quarter. Decided to not cut rates. So essentially, what happens is this news kind of comes out, surprises a lot of people. I believe the Fed meeting was at the very, very end of July. So they come out, they decide to not cut rates, keep that price of borrowing very, very high. So that essentially, any single thing that you have in your life that has interest, that's impacted in some kind of indirect way by the interest rate that the Federal Reserve sets for the kind of entire economy. And, for example, the mortgage is based off of the 10-year Treasury bonds, and the 10-year Treasury bonds have been very, very high, but people expected it to come down, so the mortgage rate has gone the lowest it's been all year. But this happened in the kind of end of July, first few days of August. This was like August 2nd, like just a few days later, this past Friday. We had the jobs report, which was a really, really bad jobs report. Not cataclysmic, but it was way, way worse than a lot of people expected. But that kind of set off a tailspin because, again, this is Jen S. Smilek in the New York Times, essentially putting it in a succinct paragraph here. As turmoil swept through the global financial markets on Monday, fueled by concerns the economy is heading for a hard landing, investigators began to speculate that the Federal Reserve could jump in to cushion the fallout with an emergency interest rate cut. Knowing Jerome Powell, this doesn't seem like something he would be all too thrilled about doing. But again, let's break that down here. With the hard landing, that refers to, with the inflation being a big problem early on in the Biden administration. The Fed says, okay, we're going to tighten up the money supply in the economy. We're going to raise the cost of borrowing money to kind of constrict the economy. And what a lot of people thought was it would have to cause a lot of people to lose their jobs, cause a lot of people to not be able to spend as much money in the economy because it was kind of the price-based inflation was what a lot of people thought the problem was. But that was kind of proven wrong over the years and the quarters and the months as they played out, because the interest rates remained high and for a while were rising, but inflation was coming down, and critically, unemployment was staying very, very low. Unemployment this time finally risen, and the idea, those three dynamics of interest rate high, inflation going down, and the interest rate is supposed to come down when inflation goes down. Inflation essentially is at that 2% target that the Fed likes to have. The interest rates still are high though, and that a lot of people thought that was going to, again, raise unemployment very, very high. But unemployment up until this point has not been very, very high. That was supposed to be a soft landing. That kind of hardened up quite a bit with this bad jobs report, which caused a lot of fear and sent a lot of panic circulating through the global economy, especially within Japan for whatever reason. I honestly, personally don't understand why it was Japan of all places that got affected, but they had their worst day in I think 13 years on their Nikkei stock market. But essentially now what that means is the Fed has to kind of loosen back the economy again, ease up on the rates. That's what a lot of investors are going to want to see, and it's all but certain the Fed is going to do that at their next meeting, which is in September. So that's going to be a little bit of a long way to go there. So that's why they're saying, why don't we come in? Why don't we cut rates now? It's going to be at the end of September. Emergency rate cut for the Fed if it starts to get really bad. But the stock market, a lot of people have been, whispering about that, and that although the Fed the stock market crashing down in one day is not going to be a very, very big deal for anyone. I think the New York Times had a column about just keep on carrying on. It's just one day, and I think there's I forget exactly where it came from. The stock market saying the stock market just being a graph of rich people's feelings. But I think that is kind of even when you take that moniker, it's kind of an interesting thing to look at, the rich people's feelings aspect of it, because the rich people are looking at Jerome Powell not lowering the interest rates, not lowering the cost of borrowing, and they're seeing unemployment begin to really rise. By I guess it's all relative here. We're talking less than 1% of unemployment rise, but still, that is a big departure from the trend that it was going in already. So they're seeing those two things going together and saying, oh, shoot, we're headed for a recession. This is going to be pretty bad. So that's why you can expect to see a potentially pretty significant interest rate cut, certainly some kind of interest rate cut over the next period of time, which hopefully will ease some of the pressures in the jobs market and get people generally feeling more comfortable about the economy again and complete that soft landing, which is, again, the interest rate raise to cut inflation. Inflation is now cut, so now you lower the interest rates back again to normal for the cost of borrowing to avoid a massive spike in unemployment like we could be seeing the beginnings of with this latest jobs report. So just a quick little spin around of what's going on in the economy. Hope that made some sense to the layman out there, and most importantly to the experts. So Google has just taken a big L, so to speak, in the U.S. District Court of the District of Columbia. So Judge Amit P. Mehta said in a 277-page ruling that Google had abused a monopoly over the search business. The Justice Department and states had sued Google, accusing it of illegally cementing its dominance in part by paying other companies like Apple and Samsung billions of dollars a year to have Google automatically handle search queries on their smartphones and their web browsers. Google is a monopolist and has acted as one to maintain its monopoly, Judge Mehta said in its ruling. This is Dave McCabe in the New York Times from Washington. The ruling is a harsh verdict on the rise of the giant technology companies that have used their roots to influence in the internet to influence the way we shop, consumer information, and search online, and indicates a potential limit of big tech's power. And it's likely to positively influence other government antitrust lawsuits against Google, Apple, Amazon, and Meta, the owner of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. The last significant antitrust ruling against a tech company targeted Microsoft more than 2 decades ago, and pretty much since then, it's kind of had this unmitigated growth, unregulated growth, and now they're getting access to so much more data, controlling so much more about how we live our lives in pretty much every single solitary detail. And the U.S. government, probably in one of the best parts of the Biden administration, from Jonathan Cantor, who's the head of antitrust at the DOJ, to Lena Khan, who is the FTC chair, have really been putting in these rulings, not just against big tech, but against other places. But, big tech is what we're talking about at the moment. But, this is... And they have, in the lack of faith I have in the integrity of the U.S. court system and the judges to not side with big business and kind of just generally, right-wing pro-business causes, I was pretty heartened in a good way to see. I guess you can't be really heartened in a bad way, but I was very encouraged to see this come through because it sets up. It's kind of unclear, I guess, is the sense I get. And again, I'm no expert on this, but it's unclear what exactly this will have in terms of impact on, how you can search on the day-to-day with Google. I guess it's going to be, create more windows for other search engines to break through from other probably big tech companies on platforms like Apple and on Microsoft, so which is kind of the default platform that's been, too common. Apple and Samsung having billions of dollars a year to have Google automatically handle search queries on their smartphones and web browsers. So that was essentially the allegation that got them in a lot of trouble. But this also, most importantly, is going to go really kind of help in a big way for a lot of the other big tech companies that have been under a lot of scrutiny. For example, Apple, with regards to the monopoly over Android users and texting that we talked about on a show, I believe, earlier this summer. And that is definitely something that is going to impact people's lives in a big way, and it's going to roll back some of the unrestrained growth and power, unregulated growth of big tech. Definitely something to keep an eye out, and a good example, I would say, of one of the best parts of the Biden administration working as it should. So Israel has been up to no good as lately, at least especially in the eyes now of the U.S. Obviously been committing a genocide for the past 10 months in Gaza. But now they are beginning to piss off the United States too, as they have recently killed, I think let's get the list here, Ismail Haniyeh, a senior Hezbollah commander, Fouad, I think was one of his names. I forget whether it was his first name or his last name, and I also forget his other name. But again, key Hezbollah commander killed, and Ismail Haniyeh, who was Hamas's Politburo chief. And really two significant blows there in Hezbollah, and then also an unforgettable slap in the face to their backers in Tehran. So it really major assassinations. I believe they killed two Hezbollah commanders in Beirut. They also came out recently with a kind of confirmation. They re-emphasized, like, hey, we even though they originally reported that they killed Mohammed Daif, who is the head of Al-Qassam in Gaza, in like early July, so they just recently came out and said, yeah, we killed Mohammed Daif. And the important part of that is especially the fact that they assassinated Ismail Haniyeh in Iran, not in Tehran, in Iran, not when he was in Doha, when he was Benjamin Netanyahu was literally sending him money to live in Doha. No, they waited till he came to Iran for a key reason, which was to assassinate him so that Iran had to respond. And it wasn't a coincidence that Haniyeh was the one that was assassinated, because he was one of the more moderate, he was one of the more, people in Hamas that was actually pushing for a deal. And we know that Netanyahu does not want a deal, and he is trying to set up for himself a really golden opportunity, because if you're Netanyahu, you're looking at the situation, you're like, I could negotiate with Hamas, put an end to this war, and kind of admit military defeat, and probably, or try and spin it, but essentially it would be perceived by a lot of people in my country as a military defeat. I would have to resign. I would face innumerable investigations, both on my handling of the war on October 7th and my kind of corruption charges that I am facing. That would all come kind of raining down on me. Or I could take a moment where the White House is in complete disarray, and everyone in America is loving me, and I can go get 58 consecutive standing ovations from the United States government and the Congress. I could take that moment to assassinate key people in key places all around the Middle East, and potentially go and start, World War III, and draw the United States into this mess. And again, go and get Israel kind of being the spoiled kid, go getting their dad, and dad comes in the United States. Go, what's going on here? They're all, my son could do no wrong, and then all of a sudden, Benjamin Netanyahu points to Hezbollah, points to, and again, 83%, I think, was the number, according to nonpartisan analysis of the attacks that have been exchanged between Hezbollah and Israel have been from Israel to Hezbollah. So any fair evaluation of the evidence will show that it is a pretty one-sided, I guess you could say, series of skirmishes on the Lebanon-Israel border. And many, many people have talked about the incentive that Netanyahu has to continue this war, and why not continue it with a United States that has proven that they'd be willing to do anything to help Netanyahu in a situation like this, and why not continue it or really expand it to Hezbollah when you have and you can do that by assassinating key Hezbollah commanders in key places in Beirut. And why not, but while you're at it, go full bore, get the U.S. to come in and try and get Israel and the U.S. to take out Iran once and for all, something that we know that Netanyahu has wanted to do for a long time. So Netanyahu, by doing this, was a pretty clear concerted effort. It's to say, I don't want a ceasefire, I want total victory, I want total annihilation of Gaza. And while I'm at it, I'm going to try and get the U.S. put into this regional war where they have no choice to come in and defend us and go to war against Iran. And maybe, just maybe, with their help, we can take out one of our worst regional enemies in Iran, and by extension, all of their proxies. So that is clearly what Israel is trying to do here. And, with that kind of mindset, you can map all of their actions into that framework very, very easily, and it makes a lot of sense, in my personal opinion. And you can look at what they did there and what they would do in a potential response. They would view any kind of response by Iran to repeated provocations as an escalation to go further with these groups. And, again, taking out Iran would most likely fatally doom all these proxy groups that they have against the Middle East. So that's another reason why Israel is desperate to get the U.S. to come in and join their side on this. But the question is, how will Iran respond? They're definitely going to respond. They're definitely going to try and, they're not going to telegraph it like they did in April. They apparently told Israeli and U.S. diplomats that they're going to have an attack, and roughly when it was going to be back in April when they responded to the assassination of I believe it was a Hezbollah commander it was an Iranian commander in Syrian territory, in Damascus. And so that I was actually in the Iranian consulate in Damascus, and I remember it was April, feels like 3 years ago. And that was a relatively low-key attack. This is, by all accounts, going to be less low-key. It's going to really try and draw some blood, but not going to be something that comes out and escalates to a full-on war. Iran has proved very restrained, I think it's fair to say, in dealings with Israel, dealings with the United States, especially in the past 5 years or so, in the post-Iranian nuclear deal world. So we have Israel that is very, very much interested in escalation with U.S. support against a web of its enemies in the region, and Iran, who kind of sees that game, knows it has to respond, kind of wants to respond, and a lot of the people in the region, a lot of the proxies in the region are way less moderate and way less calculating on this than Iran is. So they don't want to get in a regional war. They don't want the damage that would incur, but they know they have to respond, and they have to do it seriously. So look for an attack, an inevitable, imminent retaliation that will try and bridge that divide, kind of thread that needle, essentially, in relatively short period of time. And again, this is the other story where it could be all irrelevant by the time this episode comes out and the attack happens. But I would bet, if you're listening to this right now, you could probably expect that attack to be somewhere in the middle of, more severe than the last time, but not something that is going to really lead to an all-out war and kind of give both sides an opportunity to kind of temporarily cool down. But then, of course, Israel, given that it has its strategy of starting that regional war to get the U.S. to come in and help take out all its enemies, Israel will then resume what it has been doing, just the same way it resumed after April in terms of escalatory actions towards Iran. And a really kind of an example of some pretty horrific journalism here, and not by the author of the story, Max Tanney, in Semaphore, but by the Wall Street Journal. So Tanney writes, in January, the Wall Street Journal made an explosive claim. Quoting intelligence reports, the paper reported that not only had 12 members of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, taken part in the October 7th attack on Israel, but 10% of the agency's 12,000 workers in Gaza had ties to militant groups. The New York Times on January 28th published a detailed story about the 12 workers who aided in the October 7th attacks, followed by the journal's broader piece about UNRWA staff's alleged links to Hamas, a 1-2 punch that had immediate impact on the agency. More than a dozen countries, including Germany and Britain, froze funding to UNRWA, stalling a total of $450 million. I believe those two put it back on at this point. It was a massive scandal that put the organization, the main conduit for aid to Gaza, on the defensive. But months later, the paper's top editors overseeing the standards privately made an admission. The paper didn't know and still doesn't know whether the allegation based on Israeli intelligence reports was true. The fact that Israeli claims haven't been backed up by solid evidence doesn't mean our reporting was inaccurate or misleading, that we have walked it back, or that there is a correctable error here. Cindy Attorney, the chief news editor, wrote in an email earlier this year seen by the Intercept, by Semaphore. I get too used to reading the Intercept with these kind of journalism exposés. But this really is indicative, and it really is an incredibly deceitful, dishonest, and just enabling of genocide thing to do, because you are kind of very slimely and very kind of coyly, like this lady knows exactly what she's doing when she's saying this. Like, this is something that, the fact that Israeli claims haven't been backed up by solid evidence doesn't mean our reporting was inaccurate or misleading, that we have walked it back, or that there is a correctable error here. So what they're saying is, just because we said that Israel was saying it doesn't mean that it wasn't true. We were just saying what Israel said. That's just hall monitor bullshit, even in the best of times. And the worst of times, it leads to the complete cutoff of aid into a population that's being genocided, and leads the genociding state to launch unprecedented continued attacks on UN schools, on UN officials, every single day for months and months on end. Like, those two things are directly related to the attacks on UNRWA and the cutting off of funding to UNRWA that was really was enabled by this story. And it's really disgusting that they're able to just, in the Wall Street Journal, sit kind of coyly by and say, we didn't make any mistakes. We were just reporting what Israel said. You're not supposed to report what Israel said. You're supposed to report what is true. And there is no evidence to any of these claims. And, there was no evidence that justified in any way cutting off and essentially destroying the best and most effective manager of Gaza and kind of the Palestinian society in UNRWA. Like, they hired, local Palestinian people to help other Palestinian people. They were the best at getting aid into these areas, the best at maintaining some sort of order and making sure, maybe kids had something to do. They learned a little bit. I've seen videos of classrooms being held, or classes being held in tents. UNRWA and the people that staffed it, the 12,000 Gazans that staffed it, they were the ones that were able to do that, and that continued attacks on that is what is causing so much suffering and making the Palestinian identity attacked every day. That story, in turn, the Wall Street Journal story, was a key enabler of it. So it's really disgusting for Emma or Elena Cherney, or whatever the hell her name is, to come in and say this, we just weren't making any mistakes. It wasn't. We were just reporting what Israel said. It's just it is incredibly dishonest, and it is incredibly shameful. And I think it's going to be, hopefully, a black stain on the record of the Wall Street Journal when this comes out. The fact that they did this, they reported the story, and it had so many clear consequences on the lives of so many Palestinians. This is from Al Jazeera. On Tuesday, a progressive Democrat will fight to save her seat in the United States Congress against a threat from within her own party. Cori Bush faces a punishing primary challenge from County Prosecutor Wesley Bell as they both compete to represent Missouri in the House of Representatives. But the experts say their battle boils down to one central issue: how to approach Israel's war in Gaza. So essentially, what's been going on with this is a very similar situation to Jamal Bowman in New York with regards to unprecedented, although it has not been as unprecedented. It hasn't been, the most expensive primary election ever in the way that Bowman's was. But AIPAC, United Democracy Project, has spent a lot of money in this race. They've been attacking Cori Bush on a lot of different issues, not necessarily on Gaza, but, attacking her for, not being a good enough Democrat, which, unlike Bowman, she has done a better job of trying to counter those allegations and has, I think, some better kind of more deep-rooted support within the community, and also, I would say, is able to do that, is able to point to other issues, for example, on eviction, that she really did take a big stand on. She held slept outside of Congress in order to raise awareness for the ending of the eviction moratorium in the wake of, COVID in 2022. So that was a big thing that I've seen in her kind of campaign literature, pointing to that. Also working with Biden on the Build Back Better and the infrastructure bill and things like that. And essentially, it is a kind of interesting district because it is, in some parts it's very rich and white, in some parts, in most parts, it's much less rich and much less white. So, that's obviously going to be the areas where, Cori Bush comes in and thrives. She is a former nurse. She's been homeless herself, and she's absolutely incredibly inspiring person to have in Congress. Somebody who has had that experience, who knows what it's like, and is going to stand up and fight for issues like that on eviction. She was the only member of Congress to come out and do that when the eviction moratorium came to an end. And of course, she has been an incredibly strong voice for the Palestinians. This is only the beginning, Bush told the Associated Press in an interview published last week, because if they can unseat me, they're going to continue to come after more Democrats. The race is again, AIPAC pouring $8.4 million into backing Bell's bid, Wesley Bell, Bush's opponent's bid for Congress. So it is very, very hard to know, and the polls on this have been much closer because I think Bush has been a bit better in kind of consolidating and holding on to her base, because there's a lot more kind of progressive-friendly base in Bush's district. This is going to be probably a much more accurate test of the spending, because of the salience of the Palestinian issue among the Democratic base, because Cori Bush, I think, is a bit of a better kind of politician, although maybe not the best. I think maybe Omar or Tlaib may be the best politician in the squad, or honestly, honestly, in terms of just sucking up to the right people at the right time, I would have to say I would have to give that title to AOC. But it is still really important to continue to have Cori Bush in Congress, and she has been, I think, more effective than Bowman, I think, for a large part because her district is more friendly to kind of left-wing politics than Bowman in terms of consolidating her race. I think she was down by a lot, but then I think there's a poll that had her down by 2. So it's essentially, make polls like that with the primary polls like that essentially means it's a toss-up, 50-50 situation. So it's really going to be a pretty effective when you have a base of the Democratic Party, which is or an electorate that is more like the base of the Democratic Party, which I think you do in this race much more so than you did with the Jamal Bowman race in the suburbs and your kind of northern suburbs of New York City. You're going to have a much more accurate picture of how salient and how motivating this issue of Gaza is, and this issue of Palestine is to the Democratic base, based on how Cori Bush is able to fare in her primary tomorrow. We'll have a lot more for you. Hopefully able to get a show out for tomorrow, recovering all these results, but you do have a very good set stage for the political events of tomorrow, although this episode could very well be useless 24 hours from now. Either way, we'll be back very soon at Newsflash.